Welcome to this webinar run by Shephard Media. I'm Scott Gorley, the Military Logistics Editor here at Shephard Media, and I am joined by representatives from WEW Container Systems, a THIELMANN company. With me today are Peter Hughes and Falco Pfeuffer from WEW, as well as Ross Smith, who is the NSPA Operational Logistics Support Program Technical Officer for Fuel. Today we are going to talk about the various ways in which recent military operations have helped to shape the water and fuel storage market. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Just to get the questions rolling, how have the fuel and water transport and storage requirements evolved over the last 16 or 17 years of conflict?
Over the last 15 to 20 years, we've observed and indeed been a leading part of the innovation of containerized fuel and water systems. In other words, everything in a box, full drop and go systems, much more orientated around the 20-foot ISO container than probably it was in the past. And this is really has been responding to user needs where correct me if I'm wrong, Ross, they're very often that they would have found parts missing and they couldn't complete a mission because they had to kind of mess around with nuts and bolts and so on. Here we deliver an ISO container which has a fuel store and distribution system compliant with international regulations both for marine transport, air transport, road transport, and also pumping systems for rotorcraft and land systems, gensets, as well as environmentally compliant to deployment in most theatres around the world.
Yeah, Peter, I can agree with that. A lot of the leaning now towards is a COTS, a civilian off-the-shelf solution. So things that can be put into a 20-foot ISO footprint using the logistic lift capacity of things like PLS and UK drops type, where it can be picked up off the ground, taken, transported with a convoy, and then dropped off in a forward base. And then the moment it hits the ground, it's an easy set-up solution, which means it can be issuing the fuel or water, whatever it needs to do, in a quick, efficient fashion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ross, have there been any observable changes based on the dynamic environment of the last 2 to 3 years?
I'll comment on where I've been doing a lot of the recent work with NATO, which is in Afghanistan. We all know that Afghanistan's changed in the past few years, where we had a lot of troops on the ground, and they required a lot of fuel and water, and I dealt with mainly the fuel side of life. But you wherever you go, you've got to have the freedom of movement, and without freedom of movement, you don't get the convoy with the fuel from A to B. You've got also, there's less troop numbers on the ground. With less troop numbers, there's less protection, etc. So any convoy is a priority, and it's that juggling act to get whatever's required on the convoy, whether it's ammunition, rations, or fuel. And so, the ways and means of getting the fuel from the main base to these forward base has changed. It used to be a lot of it by road, but without that freedom of movement, now you have to rely on air. And with air, that's a different way and means of putting fuel into an aircraft to be able to get that containerized solution if you go down that route, out the back of the aircraft, onto the base. But there's still a place for ground movement, road movement, and that's a preferred option, obviously, because it's a cheaper way of getting stores from A to B.
We'll open this next one to comments from any of you. Do you believe Material Solutions have kept up with those changing requirements in terms of both capacity and mobility? And if not, do you see solutions on the horizon?
Well, what we've actually seen, there is more and more demand for smaller and more high mobility systems, so basically moving upwards on the echelon. Previously, the whole thing started on a 20-foot footprint base, hook arm and drops capable, also PLS systems for the American guests here.
Check.
But they're becoming the demand is raising for really small, high mobile systems that can basically go on the back of a. Okay, for me, the German variant of that is a Dingo. I think the Australian one is a Thales Bushmaster.
An MRAP utility.
Right, MRAP utility vehicles, where you're not necessarily talking about a full ISO capability, but rather try to take as much fuel payload with you with some sort of pumping capability to move it a bit more up the front line. And I'd like Peter. I mean, you want to add something to this?
Yeah. So, but to increase that mobility, we've also been looking at rotorcraft underslung systems, which are suitable for example, UH-60. This sort of area and lighter, and that really mandates the requirements for composite materials and other more advanced materials for us to look at in the future, which is something we're actively doing. So for very forward area logistics support, we recognize that everything needs to be air portable, and that's the direction that a lot of our designs are moving into at the moment.
In addition to the new products that you've just been talking about, is the user out there looking at upgrades to existing equipment? And if so, are there any unique challenges in maintaining that equipment?
Right. Talk about one of our main customers, which is obviously the German Armed Forces, the Bundeswehr. Just recently, they've been looking into the high mobile water systems, which is the drops-based ones, where they are by plan about to be discontinued, but they've just recently taken the decision to further continue them and give them one significant upgrade, which is the UV radiation that they have in there to keep microbiological growth, sorry, not native English here, at an acceptable level, and they want to change that technology over to an LED, a LED-based technology. Same is happening with main camp base infrastructure systems, which are a full ISO height 18 cubic systems for water supply in the camp infrastructure, basically. And it's also the chlorination dosing systems that are in there, that they're looking at upgrading those to provide at least another 10 to 15 years of lifetime of those systems, because the tank container structure itself easily has a lifespan of 25 to 30 years, if not more. And then it's just a question of the technology that's inside there. Is it still up to date? And quite often we face the challenge of that some of the parts are not discontinued, actually.
Interesting. Well, you've mentioned a number of challenges facing the user out there. Are there any other challenges confronting those who are working at the sharp end of fuel operations?
Yeah, I'd like to answer this one. And I go back to where I am with Afghanistan. I've mentioned it before. If you haven't got freedom of movement, then you've got to look at something else to get the fuel to the guys on the ground. And then that mission then is dependent on an airfield or a way of being able to get fuel there, whether by rotorcraft or by fixed wing. The issues with rotor aircraft or rotor delivery is you have a very limited supply of helicopters to be able to do this. The helicopters are bringing in other equipment, and they're bringing in the troops as well. And you're also limited by altitude and also how the fuel is stored, whether it's underslung or whether it's internal. So the preferred option is fixed wing because it's a lot of fuel in one go. But then you're still limited by those same aspects, as in altitude and also how much the payload of the aircraft that's chosen can take. So whilst you can get the fuel to the airfield, then you've got to get the fuel off the airframe and then into a storage medium. And you've got to secure that area. You've got to secure the airfield before the aircraft comes in, and then whilst the operation of getting the fuel out into the storage medium, which usually for forward bases is a blivet or a bag, or a small storage container. It's not always the priority for fuel, even though the vehicles that go around during the patrols and to manage to power the actual base itself all requires fuel. But the good bangs, the good sexy stuff like the ammunition and the troops is always the priority. and then fuel's usually on the back burner. But it's the important issue, and that goes back to trying to get that fuel, and when it gets to the location, it's easy to operate the system that's been deployed. As Peter's pointed out, a self-contained ISO container type, a small tank with inbuilt filtration, and also a pump engine, turn the key, pull the hose out, and you're issuing to whatever you need to issue, whether that's an aircraft, whether it's an MRAP, or whether it's a jerry can. So it's got to be easy use, because you may not have those specialised fuel guys actually on the ground to operate the equipment, and it could be just an infantry soldier, and he needs to be able to operate that equipment with minimum training, and the equipment's got to go first time. And then when it's being used, it's got to be easily maintained. If you get that all right, then you've won the argument with the soldier on the ground.
Well, I'd like to add what Ross just said in relation to the previous question that we had, the observable changes, which is also a very high demand. What Ross just mentioned is that, it needs to be as easy as possible to handle and to be used, down to the point that you basically have two big buttons on the system that say on and off, and the rest, the system's got to do itself, basically, but still in a very reliable way in concerns of a military environment. But then you basically just press the on button, and then you can start refueling operations with the thing.
Excellent. Shifting a bit towards a future perspective, would any of you comment on the possible roles that autonomous systems might play in last-mile supply logistics in the future?
Yeah, I'll take that one. It's Pete here. It's an area that we've been actively involved in over the last 6 to 9 months, and looking at leveraging some of the capabilities within the THIELMANN organization for smaller packet-sized palletized loads, which can be divided down even smaller. So in a sense, it's sort of an ultimate mobility solution. Just to follow on really from what Falco was saying, and Ross, in conjunction with that, quite a lot of design thought has to go into making these things simple. I always liken it to an iPhone. It just works by pressing a button, and even this old fool can figure out how to do it within a few minutes, which requires some designing in. That doesn't happen by accident. The thought's already gone into how to make those systems simple to operate. So if we'd have been having this conversation, I don't know, even 5 or 6 years ago, we'd have been talking about the metal and what the metal can do and so on and so forth. Our focus is much more these days towards a systems approach and simplicity, designing in simplicity. So I'll just return to the last mile because it is relevant to that. Once again, the last mile solutions are all about autonomous vehicles providing or material, including fuel and water, at these very forward areas in high mobility environments. And there again, it's an absolute plug and play. You want somebody to press a button or turn a handle and get their fuel and water without having to worry about how it's going to happen and so on. At the same time, with the enhancement of smart battle spaces, correct me if the terminology is wrong, it's very important for the command and control to understand what levels of supplies are out there so that they can proactively send material to the right place. So there's quite a lot of technologies that come together into this rather kind of simple. It's not a case of just sticking a tank on the back of a robot and waving bye-bye to it, hoping it comes back. Or not.
Would any of you care to comment on the overall outlook for the fuel and water logistics market as you see it?
That one I'll field and I'll forward it on to Falco afterwards. The threat, NATO's threat, loosely, has changed from one of asymmetric, and it's sort of heading back to where it was 20, 25 years ago. So, we have seen quite a significant uptick in inquiries over the last 1 year to 18 months, probably reflecting the change in potential future theatres that our clients are facing. The profile has changed as well from that of Afghanistan. So these programs are becoming much more regular rather than an urgent requirement. The programs are the programs tend to be running on a longer wick, but the market has definitely moved on from where it was 18 months to 2 years ago, I would say.
And Falco, were you going to add to that?
Well, yeah, out of the Germans' perspective, perhaps even having always been sitting in the middle of this, we're facing to waving hello again to the good old Eastern aggressor. Let's put it that way, and it's slightly sarcastic. But that together, though, with the fact that all armies that we've been in contact so far are really looking at containerizing literally anything that they want to move, with the challenge of thinking we need to have our kit there, but we don't necessarily want to have our troops there. So it all needs to be stored, but ready to be pulled out within less than 24 hours, basically, if the necessity arises. So this is something that we're also seeing, that from small systems, so 10-foot, 5-foot things even base, but full ISO frame, then up to 40-foot systems, that they have the full echelon of capabilities there. Long-term storage, and there's those systems again. Simplicity. You never know if the trained personnel is exactly in that moment there when it's being pulled out of storage. So it needs to be self-explaining and very, very reliable, even though when it's sat, whatever, for 12, 18 months idle in some storage, or even longer.
Excellent. I know we've talked a little bit about some of the technologies that are being explored there at the company, but looking toward the future, do you see any other special technologies or capabilities that the user might require?
Well, yes. I mean, very conservatively spoken, I mean, steel is the material of choice, but we've been looking into composite materials for quite a while now, and we think this could be the future for at least some of the applications. When weight is an issue, for example, as Peter mentioned previously, helicopter underslung, for example. I mean, we're talking about 5,000 to 8,000 pounds on the hook. That's not much, but you want to bring as much fuel as possible forward. So if you then compare a steel system over a fully composite built system on a 10-foot frame, you're probably talking of a delta of 200, 300, 400 kilograms, which is suddenly something like 500 to 600 liters of fuel, and that is almost one battle tank full of fuel, if we're thinking of that direction. And also, what we keep seeing is the concept questions of first intelligence systems, but then also the energy generation is a subject, and that then being tied together, how to integrate our systems in sort of smart grids, in both terms of energy generation, but GBA, so generic base architecture, that's also an emerging subject with the armies around the world that we are in contact with.
Yeah, I have to agree with the weight reduction. We've flown missions by air where we had a maximum capacity that we could have taken about 17,000 litres, but due to altitude and where we go, we've been restricted down to 15,000 litres. Well, that's 2,000 litres that we're already missing before we even land. And the 2,000 litres is a lot of MRAPs being filled and camp generation. So if we, certainly with the storage medium that is for the future, those composite materials, I think, have an important place in the construction of any tankage or system that is employed.
Well, gentlemen, I would like to thank you for joining Shephard Media at today's webinar, and now perhaps it's time to shift to some questions from the audience. While we're waiting for that first question, I'd like to offer an observation, I think. From a U.S. perspective, I'm struck by the timeliness of our discussion here. In the aftermath of last fall's release of the Army's multi-domain battle concept, Army logisticians have been looking at issues exactly like this. And last week, they released a white paper. The white paper is called Demand Reduction, Setting Conditions to Enable Multi-Domain Battle. But when they released it last week, one of their big points was that this is a starting point for further discussions, exactly the kinds of discussions we're having here today. So as I look to some questions coming in, we have one here. In a contested environment, without that freedom of movement, isn't autonomous convoy resupply an obvious way forward? Falco or Peter?
Yeah, hi, it's Peter here. I think that's a very valid question, and again, something that we have been looking into. Obviously, it's less heavy on troops to support logistics operations and keeps people out of harm's way. And it's something that's relatively easily doable.
One of the things that came out of last week's Association of the U.S. Army Global Force gathering down in Huntsville, Alabama, is that the Army is across the board quicker to embrace optionally manned, where convoys could be manned in some situations and not in others. So I think some of these systems, some of these opportunities here play exactly into that. Okay, we have another question here. Can you explain a little more about the work you've undertaken in composite materials and what that means for the WEW product range?
Sure, it's a technology area that some of us are involved in already, and it's certainly a technology area that we are actively looking at for these sorts of forward area operations. I can't go into too much detail because there's some commercial sensitivity about it right now.
I see. Okay. In the context of current operations, how much of a reliance is there on contracted logistics support, and does that change the nature of the challenge out there?
It's Peter again here. I'll field that. Well, CLS is very much the order of the day and has been for a good number of years. How much does it change the operational status? I think we work closely with CLS providers to deliver a solution that meets their needs, and these requirements are more orientated towards products there's the program's life cycle is much shorter, and the deliverable required is usually in much shorter order as well. I think that's how I would comment. Falco, anything from you?
Well, I'd say it's the CLS, obviously, that's moving forward, but also the CFA, the contracting for availability. Even the German armed forces have started to really look into it, and we're not known to be the first ones for new ideas. But just recently, there was a contract awarded for a complete camp infrastructure with everything, to turnkey camp that they've awarded, and that's currently actually being set up in Lithuania as part of the NATO exercises that are going on there. So I think it's becoming more and more important to have the flexibility as a contractor also to be ready to provide these services yourself.
Excellent. One of the things that has come out of the Army's multi-domain battle concept that is confronting U.S. Army logisticians right now is the objective to enable Army units to conduct semi-independent operations for up to 7 days. Clearly, this is a dramatic change from past thinking in terms of logistics resupply. There's a lot of talk that this is going to require more focus, not on large logistics convoys, large logistics resupply activities, but smaller ones, movements throughout the battle space to particular companies, particular battalions. Do you have any thoughts on how 7 days of operation might impact some of these systems?
Well, I'll take that one for the beginning. I think that pretty much ties into the question that we had before during the webinar, where it's the raising demand of smaller and more mobile systems, really, that can also go into the back of an MRAP type vehicle. It is quite a challenge, because if you think about 7 days of something between 10 to a couple of hundred people, I mean, that amounts of water and fuel that they need just to keep themselves running, not talking about even ammo, spare parts and that sort of stuff, that's quite a challenge. So again, that leads to smaller size systems, which lighter tower weights to be able to take more product with you in the end. It's something that we've previously said already. We've been looking at quite a while, and we see the demands rising for that. So it pretty much matches what you've just said, Scott.
It sounds like the Army will welcome that sort of a system into the discussion here as they look forward. Fantastic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Any other questions from the audience at this point? We'll give them just a minute here. Okay, well, seeing none, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your participation today. Would very much, like to thank WEW, a THIELMANN company, and all of our presenters. So thank you very much for your time, and we will look forward to continuing these discussions and expanding them in the future.